Alrighty, so hot module replacement. Hot module replacement is a very, very cool feature that the Webpack dev server and the Webpack dev middleware use. And basically it allows us to, well, hot swap our modules when they change. Now, generally speaking, that'll only really work well with CSS. It can work with JavaScript. Now, I know some of you guys might be thinking that sounds really terrifying, hot module replacing your JavaScript, as in the page doesn't reload and your JavaScript gets updated, and it can be really scary. It's an opt-in feature, basically meaning you can write some JavaScript code and have it be replaced in line in your application. But the first thing we're going to look at is how we can replace our styles in our application, just like we had that live reload server in the previous video with our Gulp watch task. Now, I'm going to do this in two phases. I'm going to show you guys the straight up Webpack config for it. So I'm going to show you guys, if you want to use hot module replacement, what you have to do to the config. And I'm going to show it in the context of this config file itself. Then I'm going to move these alterations out into our Gulp file so that these alterations that enable hot module replacement only exist when we have our watch task. These are not things we want to add to production, but just to make it clear what we're doing, I am going to do it here first. So the first thing is we need to import Webpack. So I'm going to say Webpack equals require Webpack. That's because there's a plugin that we're going to need to add to our Webpack builder, or our Webpack config. So what I'm going to do is down here in our plugins, which it doesn't exist yet, I'm going to create an array of plugins. And the first plugin, or the only plugin I'm going to add for now, is going to be new Webpack dot hot module replacement plugin. All right, that's the first step. The second step is that we need to inject additional JavaScript into our application. So the way we can do that is by, in our entry, we can add in modules. And I'm going to change this string into an array, and I'm going to prepend 2 additional modules to it. Now that's important because the way Webpack expects modules to be loaded, you have the first things that are listed are just modules that are added on to this particular chunk. And then you have the last module in this array, which is considered to be the entry point. So the 2 modules we need to pull in are going to be Webpack dev server / client. And then the one after that is going to be Webpack hot only dev server. So these are the 2 additional modules. Now, these modules are just straight up Node modules that we can actually go look at the source of if we wanted to. If I opened up Node modules, located Webpack dev server, go away. If I located Webpack dev server, and client should be right here. So it's going to import this index.js file for this module. And then for the Webpack hot only dev server, it's going to import Webpack /hot /only dev server. So those are the 2 additional modules we're going to be adding into our thing. And that's almost it. The next thing we need to do is open up our package or our Gulp file and jump down to our Webpack's dev server's instantiation and add hot, not hit, hot equals true. So we need to tell the Webpack dev server that it needs to start its own hot reload server. So it's 2 steps. Basically, we need to tell the client about the Webpack dev server and how it should load it. Then we need to tell the Webpack dev server that it needs to expose itself in as a hot module reloader. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and do dev watch and see what happens. So give it a quick second to do its first compilation. And it compiled. Let's jump over here and refresh. Now we'll notice something interesting right here. We'll see HMR waiting for update signal from WDS, Webpack dev server, and we see our other stuff. And then we see WDS hot module replacement enabled. So let's test it out. It's going to be difficult having all 3 of these things on the screen at the same time, but I'll do my best for you guys. Let's go ahead and open the DevTools, and I will go ahead and bring them to dock on the bottom, which I normally don't like doing, but in intense situations like this, it's looks a little nicer. And then let's go ahead and hop over into our source styles site.less, and let's change something. Let's take out the background and hit Control S. and we get a recompilation. So put it back in, hit Control S, and we get another one. Now, it does take a moment. You'll notice it is taking about a second and a half to reload this. That's because of Webpack, or not Webpack, that's because of Bootstrap itself. If I didn't have this dependency on Bootstrap, it would take a lot less time to do the hot module replacement. See how it's only taking 132 milliseconds now. But Bootstrap is going to, of course, bring in some overhead. I still find the overhead to be acceptable, however. So yeah, but what happens if we try to change a JavaScript file? So if I come over here and open up scripts application.js and say console log whoa, and hit Control S, notice how it says the following modules couldn't be hot reloaded. They would need a full reload. Now, it doesn't go out and actually reload it for us, which is what some live reloads do, but I personally like that. When working in JavaScript, when working in any language, I hit Control S all the time. And the problem with it reloading the page after you've hit Control S in a JavaScript file is that you're going to get a lot of refreshes and they'll just be obnoxious. So I generally don't like to hot reload my JavaScript anyway. But yeah, there are a couple other interesting things to note about Webpack Dev Server. Now, if you're just using straight up HTML, kind of like what we're doing here, where we have one HTML file that we've been hitting through our HTTP server, then you can actually have Webpack Dev Server serve out the entire HTTP site itself. And it'll even come with a handy little reloading bar and it'll be all fancy and all that stuff. The problem with that is I generally don't like using the Webpack Dev Server in that way. Instead, I like it where we have what we have here, where we have two servers. Our application server, quote unquote, which is our HTTP server right here. And then we have our Webpack Dev Server over here serving out our assets. That means that our app server could be anything. It could be a Node application, it could be a Rails application, PHP, ASP.NET, whatever. And doing it this way allows us to not care about the backend. Now, there are ways within the Webpack Dev Server to do this weird sort of proxying, where you hit the Webpack Dev Server, but then it proxies to a custom backend server. I just didn't find that as useful as what I showed you guys here. I think this sort of way of using the Webpack Dev Servers is preferable simply because it works in almost any scenario you can imagine. The only thing I might suggest looking at is if you are writing a Node.js application. And so if you're interested, so if you're running a Node.js application, you can install the Webpack Dev middleware, and this will plug in right into a Express application or whatever, and it'll do everything the Webpack Dev Server does, but it'll run in the same process and serve out using the same URL as your Node.js application itself. So if you don't want to deal with having two servers running at once and you're running Node, then go for it. Otherwise, this way that I showed you guys is perfectly acceptable. All right, so that's it for live reloading, I think. If you're interested in live reloading JavaScript, you do actually have to go in and make alterations to JavaScript. It's an opt-in feature. You can read about that on the docs. So yeah, the last thing I want to do in this video is I want to go ahead and I want to move our Webpack Dev Server configuration out from our Webpack config so that it's not present in every instance where we use this configuration. So I'll go ahead and split my window and I'm going to jump over here, and then in the dev watch, first thing I'll do is I'll replace my plugins. So I'm going to take this out, I'm going to cut it, but this is important. I am going to leave my plugins as an array, as an empty array. That way, up here in my dev watch, I can simply say config.plugins.push new hot module replacement plugin. Next up, for this guy, we'll go ahead and take him out there. For this guy, there's a couple ways we can do this. I could go ahead and make both of these just arrays by default. That's not going to change their behavior. And then I can come in here and say config entry application, and then I can pass in splice 0, 0 for the two indices, and then pass in these two items, and then I can say config entry contact splice 0, 0, and then pass in these two guys. That's one way to do it. So this will go in and make these items have these two additional modules at their start. Or I could leave it how it was and just write a loop to do that for me. So let's do the second way, because that's a lot less code. Well, it's a lot more code on the left-hand side, but it's going to be a lot less of a concern on the right-hand side, especially if we add another entry point. So let's do that. I'm going to say for let entry name in config.entry. I'm going to say if not config.entry has own property entry name, continue. Then I'm going to say let entry items equals config.entry at entry name. Then I'm going to detect to see if entry items is a string or an array. And if it's an array, convert it into an array. So I'm going to say if type of entry items equals string. Then I'm going to say entry items equals config entry at entry name equals new array with entry items. So what we're doing here is we're aliasing out our entry items. If it's a string, then go ahead and turn it into an array, and then reassign that both back on the existing config, as well as our local alias for our entry items. Then I can simply say entry items.splice, passing in 0, 0, and then passing in our two modules we want to splice into the beginning. So again, splice, if you're unfamiliar, we have the start parameter where we want to start, and then we want another parameter for how many items do we want to delete. And then the remaining items are just appended wherever this start entry was. So this has the effect of prepending these two items onto that. So now I can remove these two hard-coded bits. And now both our application and our contact will have the Webpack dev server and the hot only dev server added to it. So let's come back here and let's just make sure our configuration is valid. I'm going to go ahead and restart our task here. And refresh. And we see it does indeed load. Now let's go ahead and modify something. Let's go ahead and open up our site.less. I'm just going to nuke the background. Come back to Chrome, and you see the background is indeed nuked. So come back here, add it back in, and it gets loaded back in without a page reload. All right, so stuff and things. So we have a Webpack configuration. We've already seen like the benefit of using Gulp with Webpack because it allows us to kind of mutate our configuration based off specific areas. So there's a couple more things we need to discuss about Webpack, and one of those things is a production scenario. So far, we've only been working in a sort of development mode. In addition, we haven't talked about source maps yet. And yes, Webpack does support source maps. So we'll talk about all of that stuff in the next video, and we'll see you guys then.